Miles, welcome to the show, man. It's so nice to have you.
Thanks for having me, man.
You've said that Uprising is supposed to be a soundtrack for the crazy time that we're living in. What do you mean by that?
I felt like I had amassed a collection of songs that were dealing with common human emotions, and that in the world I was living in, my own personal sort of turmoils, I needed music that could help me dust off my knees and keep on trucking up the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that I was able to tackle some universal human conditions and sort of situations that it's sometimes difficult for us to grapple with and compartmentalize and understand how to move forward. And be they songs concerning love or friendships, brotherhood, loss, So I think I noticed that all these particular collection of tunes had kind of tied themselves together, and that there was a space in the world for that kind of music and that type of sentiment.
And I should say, you didn't make this record last week. Like, since you've made this record, and probably since we've done this interview and whenever it airs,
Right.
so much has changed in the world, and the world is experiencing so much turmoil. Has that changed the way you listen to the record that you made?
It's definitely fortuitous that
so?
that the songs apply so much more now, but I think that goes back to the initial concept that they're universal themes,
Right.
and that we're always dealing with this stuff no matter what part of the world you live in, and we're always going to seek the comforts of music to guide us through it, or at least be our friend,
Yeah.
And yeah, I made this collection of music some time ago when myself and the West Coast Get Down, which is a band of brothers who all grew up in Los Angeles together, and we decided to invest in ourselves and go and record a bunch of music that we've been working on, and we did about 170 songs in 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those songs were Kamasi Washington's The Epic, Cameron Gray's made a record, Ryan Porter, all the guys. And for Uprising, I worked closely with Tony Austin to produce it, and kind of started in his studio and transitioned to KSL. And so, yeah, it's been a long journey for this body of work, and it's interesting to see how it kind of reapplies itself to each new year that passes by, and how it's still fun to sing, it's still fun to play, and it still means something and resonates to me and to the people that I perform it in front of.
When you say that you made this record over a 30-day period along with a bunch of other records, it goes contrary to a lot of conversations I've had with musicians about how they make records. And a lot of them, especially those who have a crazy amount of money, will wait around until, like, they'll sit in the studio by themselves until the moment. Oh, now it's the moment. It's 1 a.m. Everyone got to wait around, but the moment of creation is upon us. My favorite pickup line: "The moment of creation is upon us," and we will now make the record. In some ways, what you did to make so many records, and I believe it's like 12, 14 hours a day, right?
Yeah, we go from about 10 a.m. to 2 a.m.
And that's I don't want to say a utilitarian way of making a record, but you guys had work to do every single day.
Yeah, I mean, the music that we recorded had been around us for a little while, and we were playing it in our residencies in Los Angeles, and so we kind of knew what we were up to. We knew that everybody had a lot of great music, and we're on a budget, so each person putting in a little bit of money, whatever they had, allowed us to actually put together a bit of a war chest to go in, and if we would put our heads down and cancel, turn off the cell phones, no cameras, no girlfriends, no distractions, just let the muse in, focus on the music. Each one of us has our own skill set that really aided that. Tony Austin's kind of like the danger mouse of West Coast Get Down. Like, he knows everything there is about engineering and producing, and so we had somebody on the boards that knew how these songs were supposed to sound. I'm a really hyper-organized person, and I love project management. I know it sounds so geeky for an artist to say. You
can get a job at the CBC as soon as we're done after this.
I've got a fallback strategy, trust me. So it wasn't very difficult for me to kind of look at the goal and put it in order and make these pins and move everybody's time around so that we could do 170 songs in 30 days.
But what about creation? I mean,
Well,
what about not waiting around for the moment? What about having to make it happen right there?
I think I can speak for myself.
Yeah.
Each one of us, interestingly enough, would kind of pick time slots that worked for them. And by that, I mean, it all comes down to the muse, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And inspiration is what we're waiting on, right? So take Ronald Bruner. He is most creative at 1 o'clock in the morning. So we would move his sessions to times where he could be most available to receive whatever he wanted. Right. For me, I'm very careful with my muse, and I nurture that relationship, and it's something that I believe in very, very dearly. And so I'm kind of on tap for it whenever, because I spend my entire waking existence like making sure that the muse is okay, we good, all right?
Yeah. Checking
some
in.
piano, just make sure everything's cool, because there is so much business you have to do in music, and there are so many logistics that when it's time to create, to sit around burning money or time is not something we had the luxury of doing. And you also talking about world-class musicians. Like,
oh yeah,
we can pull things out of the sky because we've been playing together for 20 years.
But I can only imagine that, like, if your muse is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you're playing on Ronald's record at 1 in the morning.
Yeah.
I mean, I can only imagine that you had to challenge yourself in so many ways.
Well, the cool thing was that you were only responsible for the end result. You were the captain of the ship for 3 hours of the day, right? So you knew it was like your record was going to be worked on from this time slot. And when it wasn't your turn to be stressed out about whether or not the arrangement was right or whether or not you were doing a good service to the music, when you weren't stressed out, you were just helping someone else get their vision across. And so everybody was kind of helping one another execute what they were trying to do and share the burden of the load. So, the decisions you make as the producer of your record or the writer or arranger of a song, that's a different headspace than I want to play the best bass line possible behind Ryan Porter's song. And it's a more relaxing place, a more comfortable place to be. So there was this ebb and flow of stress, relax, relax throughout the entire day. It was really amazing. I hope we get to do something that ginormous again, because it was a magical moment.
Well, I'm guessing with the success of all of these records, I'm saying that next time you probably won't all have to chip in your money, and you can probably all make your own records in your own time. But would you rather go back to that?
I think there's a great benefit to it, certainly from a sonic standpoint. Like, if Tony was putting together some special drum kit for Kamasi's tune, I was like, that's the drum kit I want on Shadow of Doubt. It would be up.
Right.
So when it came to my turn, I already knew what I wanted, so I get to take a piece of, Tony's creativity that was inspired by one song and bring it have it inspire what I want my song to sound like. Or if I pulled up some beautiful delay for a solo in Brandon Coleman's tune, and Cameron would say, oh, I want that to be the intro of my next song. So in that way, I think it's really beneficial, and I'm surprised that more artists haven't combined their efforts and their records and their projects like that in the past. Or maybe they haven't, we just don't know about it precisely.
Well, I also just don't think they're all as good as you guys are. Like, I also don't think they're all as versatile as you guys are.
Well, I'll take that compliment and run with it.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Miles Mosley. He's here in the Q studio with his double bass and his band performing songs from his new record, Uprising. And what struck me when I was reading about this record and reading about you and your playing was this experimental philosophy that you encouraged. I read that at the Piano Bar in Hollywood, where you did a long-running residency, you would tell other members of the West Coast Get Down not to play the first thing that came into their head. And that reminded me of reading about Miles Davis, the Plug Nickel record he made in Chicago, where Tony Williams was on the plane. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And he said to them, hey, whatever your first impulse is when you want to play behind Miles tonight, because Miles had traveled separately, play the opposite of that.
Right.
And let's see how he does. And let's see how we do. I'm so curious, from a musician at your level, so much of us we need comfort. What does going against your instincts give you in music?
Well, I think it challenges you to make sure that you're tapped into something and that you're not coasting and you're not doing the things that you practiced. And that conversation came from sort of investigation that Tony Austin, so Miles Davis had Tony Williams, and I had Tony Austin.
Miles and Tony. It works.
Good.
We'll see you next time.
That's a first. Yeah, thank you. We'll be here all week. We had this conversation when we started our residency at Piano Bar that if we're going to come here and play twice a week, and it certainly wasn't about the money, and it was about bringing fans to us and not bouncing around so much. But if we're going to do it, we might as well try to strive to accomplish something new and get better at something. And our conversation was framed under no stock beats. And that means that it's very easy for drummers to rely on beats that have supported thousands of hit songs. But what if you didn't do that? What if you didn't do the most obvious thing? What if you just pushed yourself creatively, kept pushing the envelope to force yourself to think in the moment, to force yourself to think outside of your comfort zone? And I think that's the fastest way to grow as a musician. And so everything we started to do was sidestepping obvious decisions.
And did that go for you too, and all the players, or
Yeah.
was it just for Tony?
I mean, the investigation started from a sense of rhythm, and then once the rhythm section makes that kind of choice harmonically, the rest of the band begins to make those types of choices as well, because you start to have fun. You start to be a kid again. It's like you can enjoy one night more than the other because something magical happened, and it was because you didn't do it by rote.
Yeah.
You know, you allowed yourself to be spontaneous, and that's an awesome framework for music. And it seems kind of like an obvious thing, especially when you speak of jazz or soul music, but it's not. You get comfortable to how it is, and you get afraid to mess it up, and that's what we didn't. We were never afraid to just ruin the song.
But that being said, I know that one of the most important kind of words you hear when you hear discussions of improvisation in jazz or in new music is the word risk. The idea of taking risk with your souls, premeditated risk, well thought out risk, but risk nonetheless. And I would guess that when you're at musicians at your level, you can not risk things too often. But it must have been kind of scary at times when you were playing, and you had to go back to that original feeling of what's going to come out of me right now.
Yeah, I think it's more exhilarating. You know, it feels free. You know, you have to keep in mind that all these musicians, to that point in time that we're speaking of, we were making our living touring with, in support of other world-class musicians.
And you were playing
as sidemen.
And you're playing charts for the most part, right?
Well, yeah, or you have a musical director that tells you how it is, and this is how the song goes because it's a hit, and people want to hear the hit the way the hit is played, and that's fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that at all.
No.
But whether I'm out with Lauryn Hill or Tony's out with Solomon Burke or Brandon's out with Babyface, like we were all out doing other people's bidding.
Yeah.
So if we were going to reinvest in ourselves and try to create something that felt fresh and uniquely ours, it could only come from a place of challenge. And I don't know that it was scary as much as it was a really unique feeling, to have no shackles, to have no encumbrances that were keeping you from crossing any kind of line. It's like you went for what you heard, and that's why you practice an instrument. You don't practice an instrument so that you can be inspired. You practice an instrument so that you know where everything is and you can get your body out of the way.
Right.
So that when an idea arrives, you can execute it without having to plan it, and when you mess up, you know how to get out of it.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know, swimming in the deep end when you've been kind of hanging out in the middle, and so you build this confidence up and you know what you're doing, and so if you get caught off guard, you can turn that mistake, quote unquote, into something special.
You hear that, kids? Keep practicing. Don't stop practicing.
Never stop
practicing. I think it was, I don't know if it was you or Kamasi I heard this quote from, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, because you just mentioned you guys were side musicians to some of the greatest musicians of all time. But I did hear a quote, whereas this was when you guys all recorded tracks on Kendrick's record, it was the first time you really felt like the West Coast Get Down sound was heard on someone else's record, as opposed to just using the talents of the West Coast Get Down to achieve someone else's sound. Can you tell me a little bit about working on that
I would
record?
agree with that. I've heard Kamasi mention that before, and I got to say that record, the magic of that record really came from the tremendous amount of effort that Thundercat put into it, and Terrace Martin put into it, and Soundwave, and there's a really sort of crack team of musicians that were completely unencumbered, and I could hear also that they were able to spread their wings and offer to Kendrick the best of their abilities, and maybe some of the things that they were taking risks on. And Kendrick's a thinker, and I think that he saw that there was something special in his own backyard and wanted to experiment with that. I got to that record at the very end, almost the last 2 or 3 days, and Kamasi had done string arrangements and brought me in to perform on those and play a couple of sort of ancillary upright bass parts. And it was an interesting work environment, actually. Going to what you said before, is that everything was so secretive. I didn't know what songs I was playing. I had to listen to the record to figure out where did all this music go, because it got chopped up and moved around, but there was an intensity and a focus that felt exactly the same as what we had done at KSL. And I think that there's a spirit to making music that has that vibe to it, that maybe all of the sessions always feel that way, that there's a goal floating around in the room, and it worked. We owe a service of gratitude to that record because it really helped put what was going on with the West Coast Get Down in Los Angeles on the map.
I wonder what that was. Like, I wonder why at that moment and that particular sound on that particular record, it brought a greater attention to what you're doing, a greater attention to what Kamasi's doing. I wonder why the world was so receptive of your music at that time. I mean, it's hard for you to say.
I know there's some technical things. You know, Kendrick put that record out and really let it sit with his audience. Instead of doing a bunch of interviews, he just released it and let the music speak for itself.
Yeah.
And so you had all these wonderful publications like Pitchfork and the New York Times and I'm sure even CBC going, well, if we can't talk to Kendrick, maybe we'll talk to the musicians that worked on the record. So we started to get an attention that would normally be gobbled up by the superstar. And instead, he took a step back and let that process unfold. And so I think we benefited greatly from that. But I also think that there's an ever-evolving spotlight that moves from one city to the next. And when it's your turn, it shines really bright and kind of the whole world can see what's happened gestating in this city, be it, you know, hip-hop in Atlanta or grunge in Seattle. It's just time for that sound, and I don't think anybody can quantify it.
Well, yeah. Also, I think you're right. People can't quantify it, and I think that as we go to a time where there's chaos and there's a lot of uncertainty about our world. I mean, if you look at the world where some of the not early jazz, but around the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was almost kind of a necessity for dissonance in society. We needed things to not be perfect thirds and fifths, and it feels like we're in a time like that right now. So there was never a better time to have a hip hop record that employed the modes you guys used, and not to go so like into the notes, but into the modes and chords and shapes you guys used. It felt like the chaos, the controlled chaos of some of your music echoed the controlled chaos of some of our lives.
Yeah, that's a great observation and a great way to put it. You should write that down. But
I'll write it on the bass.
Yeah. What I will say is that I think that the yin and yang of how music unfolds is prevalent everywhere, and music is always trying to respond to whatever is currently happening in its scene. And so to follow that logic, it only makes sense that in a world where there's 15-second commercials before you watch anything that has music, there's these 3-minute time spans on music that's sort of piped in constantly in the supermarket and in your car, and there's a utilitarian use for music now, and that's not a bad thing. It exists everywhere all the time. The natural reaction to that, I believe, is for people to begin to develop a relationship with other kinds of music that they take a bit more seriously or that they take more personally. Maybe they do buy it on vinyl. Maybe they do listen to the album in its entirety instead of skipping around through a playlist, for instance. So I think where we sit in all of this is we have a sound that wishes to be nurtured by the end user versus sort of flitting about on top of their daily lives. And there's both services of music are necessary. But I think we're in a time now where it's a really natural reaction to sound bites and short stuff to get stuff that takes a little bit longer to digest.
Miles, The Uprising is one of the finest records I've heard all year.
Wow.
I really appreciate you coming in and talking to me about it.
I appreciate it. That means a lot to me, man.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, man.
All right.